Welcome to Stories HQ, where we bring you the most gripping African family dramas that will leave you breathless. Imagine this: you've just been crowned a hero before the entire kingdom. Wealth, power, and a princess await you. When a shepherd boy steps forward with a flute carved from bone, and instead of music, it sings your darkest secret in your murdered brother's voice, revealing the blood on your hands to everyone you've deceived. Thank you for your incredible support. You are the reason we keep bringing these powerful stories to life. Before we dive into the story, kindly subscribe, drop a comment below and tell us where you are watching from. Now let's get into this explosive story of two brothers, one crown, and the bones that refused to stay silent. The victory feast blazed with 1,000 torches, their flames dancing across the gilded columns of King Oladile's palace in Ioleo, the jewel of the southern kingdoms. The air hung thick with the scent of roasted goat, jollof rice spiced with bay leaves and thyme, and the heady perfume of hibiscus wine. Drummers beat out rhythms that made the very stones pulse with life, while dancers in wrapper skirts of indigo and gold spun beneath strings of cowrie shells that clicked like rainfall. This was no ordinary celebration. This was the night Jide, son of the late blacksmith Adeyemi, would be crowned the savior of Ioleo, the man who had slain the beast of the dark forest that had terrorized 3 villages and claimed 17 lives in as many moons. Jide sat at the king's right hand, his broad shoulders draped in a ceremonial agbada of crimson silk embroidered with gold thread that caught the torchlight with every breath. His head was freshly shaved, glistening with shea butter, and around his neck hung a chain of lion's teeth, the king's personal gift. He laughed freely, his white teeth flashing, his hand accepting yet another calabash of palm wine from a procession of admirers that seemed endless. Princess Amara, the king's only daughter, sat 3 seats away, her gaze flickering toward him with something between curiosity and calculation. Tomorrow, the king would announce their betrothal. Tomorrow, Jide would ascend from the son of a blacksmith to the future ruler of Ioleo. "You have brought honor back to our land," King Oladile proclaimed, rising to his feet with the careful dignity of a man who had ruled for 30 harvests. His voice, deep and resonant, silenced even the drummers. "When the beast came, when our warriors fell, when even our bravest hunters refused to enter the dark forest, you, Jide, son of Adeyemi, walked into that darkness alone and emerged victorious. The gods have blessed you with courage." The crowd erupted. Women ululated, the piercing sound echoing off the palace walls. Men stamped their feet and beat their chests. Jide rose, bowing low, his face arranged in an expression of humble gratitude that he had practiced in his mother's cracked mirror for 3 days straight. Inside his chest, his heart hammered not with joy but with the frantic rhythm of a man who knows he has stolen something priceless and is waiting, always waiting, for someone to notice. But no one had noticed. No one had asked where his younger brother Kofi had gone. No one had questioned why Kofi, who had always been the clever one, the brave one, the one their mother called my morning star, had disappeared the very same week the beast was slain. Jide had told them Kofi had left for the coast, seeking his fortune in trade. Their mother hadn't believed him. He saw it in her eyes, in the way her hands trembled when she looked at him, but she had no proof. Only a mother's instinct, which carried no weight in a court of law. The feast continued. Palm wine flowed like the great river during the rainy season. A group of acrobats tumbled across the courtyard, their bodies defying gravity. Jide forced himself to laugh at the king's jokes, to nod at Princess Amara's polite observations about the moon. His mind kept wandering to the dark forest, to the sacred grove where the massive Iroko tree stood, its roots drinking deep from the earth. He had buried Kofi there, 6 feet down, wrapped in nothing but the torn remains of his hunting tunic. He had packed the earth carefully, covered it with fallen leaves and broken branches. He had even prayed, briefly, guiltily, asking the ancestors to forgive him for what necessity had demanded. A murder born of necessity. That was how Jide had come to think of it. Kofi would have claimed the glory. Kofi, with his easy smile and natural talent, would have married the princess, would have become the king's son-in-law, would have ruled Ioleo while Jide remained forever in his shadow, the elder brother whose only inheritance was his father's rusty tools and a mud brick house that leaked during storms. No. The beast's death had been Jide's opportunity, perhaps his only opportunity, and when Kofi had struck the killing blow, when the beast had fallen with Kofi's spear lodged in its throat, Jide had seen his future dissolving like morning mist. The knife had been quick. Kofi hadn't even had time to turn around. "My king!" A voice cut through the celebration, thin and wavering but somehow piercing. "My king, if I may." The music faltered. Heads turned. Into the torchlight stepped a figure that seemed woven from the night itself. A young man, barely more than a boy, with the lean frame of a shepherd and clothes that spoke of long journeys through dust and thorn. He carried a shepherd's staff in one hand, and in the other, he held something that gleamed white in the firelight. A flute, carved from bone so pale it might have been made from moonlight itself. Jide's calabash slipped from his fingers, splashing palm wine across his new robes. He didn't notice. King Aladil frowned, his hand moving instinctively toward the ceremonial sword at his hip, though he made no move to draw it. "Who are you, stranger, to interrupt the feast of victory?" The shepherd bowed low, but there was something in his eyes. Jide saw it even from across the courtyard. Something knowing and ancient that didn't belong in the face of a boy who smelled of goat dung and would smoke. "Forgive me, great king. I am Alyamide, a shepherd from the hills beyond the dark forest. 3 days ago, while searching for a lost kid, I found this flute lying beneath the great Iroko tree in the sacred grove. It called to me, my king. Even before I touched it, I could hear it singing. Singing." The king's voice carried both curiosity and irritation. "Bone does not sing, boy. This bone does, my lord." Alyamide's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the courtyard. The dancers had frozen mid-step. Even the torches seemed to burn quieter, as if the flames themselves were leaning in to listen. "I thought perhaps it was carved by the old magic, by the hands of spirits. I brought it here to your feast, thinking perhaps a musician might know what to make of it. But every time I've held it these past 3 days, I've heard a voice. A voice that speaks a name." Jide was on his feet, though he didn't remember standing. His hands were shaking. He clasped them behind his back, willing his face into neutrality, but he could feel his mother's gaze boring into him from across the courtyard where she sat among the honored elders. She knew. Somehow, in the way that mothers always know, she had already understood what the shepherd boy was about to reveal. "Play it," King Aladil commanded, settling back into his throne with the expression of a man who expects to be entertained by a clever trick. "Let us hear this singing bone." Alyamide raised the flute to his lips. The courtyard held its breath. Even the crickets in the garden beyond the walls seemed to fall silent. Princess Amara's hand had moved to her throat, her fingers resting against the gold necklace that marked her royal blood. Jide wanted to run, wanted to bolt into the darkness and keep running until he reached the coast, the desert, the edge of the world itself. But his feet were rooted to the ground like the Iroko tree that had witnessed his crime. The shepherd blew across the flute's opening, a soft, tentative breath. And instead of music, instead of the pure tone of wind across carved bone, a voice emerged, thin, distant, but unmistakably human. Unmistakably familiar. "Jide," the voice whispered, and it sounded like wine through empty sockets, like earth settling over a shallow grave, like the last breath of a dying man. "My brother Jide. What would you do if the person you trusted most was the one who ended you? Hit like if you believe the truth can never be buried, and tell us where you're watching from." 23 years before the victory feast, before the beast, before the betrayal, 2 boys were born in the blacksmith quarter of Ialeo within the space of 18 months. Jide came first, arriving during a thunderstorm so violent that the elders declared he would be a warrior, a child born of lightning and fury. His mother, Yatund, had labored for 2 days, her screams mixing with the thunder, and when the baby finally emerged, he came out silent, his eyes already hard and watchful. Kofi was different from the moment he drew breath. He arrived on a morning so clear that the sky looked like polished bronze, and he came easily, slipping into the midwife's hands with barely a sound from Yatund. But when he opened his eyes, they were bright with an intelligence that unsettled the old women who attended the birth. "This one sees things," the eldest midwife had whispered, making a protective sign against evil. "This one will walk between the worlds." Their father, Adeyemi, loved them both with the fierce, inarticulate love of a man who worked with fire and iron. He was a master blacksmith, his reputation stretching to 3 kingdoms, and he dreamed that his sons would inherit his forge, his skill, his place in the community. But even Adeyemi, who could shape stubborn metal to his will, could not shape his sons into matching pieces. Jide was strong, yes. By the time he was 10, he could swing the great hammer for an hour without tiring, could work the bellows until the fire roared white-hot. But his heart was never in the iron. He would look up from the forge and see the warriors passing by in their leather armor, see the wealthy traders with their caravans of goods, see the king's sons riding horses draped in silk, and his hammer would slow. His blows would lose their rhythm. You think too much about what others have, Adeyemi told him once, his voice not unkind but edged with disappointment. A man who covets his neighbor's harvest will never tend his own field properly. But Jide couldn't help it. The hunger lived in him like a second heart, always beating, always wanting. Kofi, younger by 18 months but somehow always seeming older, approached the forge differently. He would study each piece their father made, a ceremonial sword, a cooking pot, a set of farming tools, with the focus of a scholar. He asked questions constantly. Why did this metal need more time in the fire? Why did that blade curve just so? What made the difference between iron that would shatter and iron that would flex? This one has the mind of an engineer, Adeyemi would say proudly, ruffling Kofi's hair. He will make weapons for kings. By the time Jide was 15 and Kofi 13, the dynamic between them had solidified into something poisonous. Jide was larger, stronger, more physically imposing, but in every contest that mattered, Kofi won. When they raced, Kofi's strategy and pacing defeated Jide's raw speed. When they wrestled, Kofi's clever holds and quick thinking overcame Jide's strength. When they competed in the forge, Kofi's blade sang with quality while Jide's showed the rough marks of impatience. Why do you let him win? Their mother asked Jide one evening, after another of Kofi's victories at the Harvest Festival's wrestling competition. She was grinding cassava, her strong hands working the mortar and pestle in a rhythm older than memory. You are bigger. You are the elder. You should command respect. Jide had looked at her, really looked at her, and seen something in her eyes that frightened him. A hunger that matched his own. Yutund had married a blacksmith when she might have married a merchant. She lived in the craftsman's quarter when she dreamed of the noble district. She had never quite forgiven the world, or her husband, for the life she hadn't lived. I don't let him win, Jide said quietly. He's just better. The word tasted like ash in his mouth. But there had been love too in those early years. Genuine love, the kind that exists before the world teaches us to compare ourselves to others. When Jide was 7 and fell from a palm tree, breaking his arm so badly that the bone showed through his skin, Kofi, only 5 years old, had run screaming for help, his small legs pumping, refusing to leave his brother's side even when the pain fever made Jide delirious and violent. When Kofi was 9 and caught malaria, the kind that made children see spirits and sometimes follow them into death, Jide had sat by his sleeping mat for 6 days and nights, spooning bitter herbs into his mouth, singing the songs their mother had taught them, praying to ancestors and gods and anything that would listen. You saved my life, Kofi had whispered when the fever finally broke, his hand finding Jide's in the darkness of their shared room. You're my brother, Jide had replied, and he meant it. In that moment, he meant it with every fiber of his being. But love and resentment can coexist in the human heart like two snakes sharing a basket. They coil around each other, feeding on the same warmth, and you never know which one will strike until it's too late. The year Jide turned 18 and Kofi 16, their father died. It was a stupid death, an unnecessary death. A spark from the forge caught the thatched roof, and Adeyemi had run back inside to save his tools, his precious tools, and the smoke took him before the flames could. They found him clutching a sword he had been making for the king's guard, a commission that would have fed the family for 3 months. The sword was perfect, untouched by fire. Adeyemi's lungs were full of ash. The funeral lasted 3 days, as was proper. The entire craftsman's quarter came to pay respects. The king himself sent a representative with a bolt of fine cloth and a purse of coins. Generous, but not generous enough to change their circumstances. Jide and Kofi stood on either side of their mother as the body was committed to the earth, her hands gripping theirs so tightly that bones ground together. You are the men of this house now, she told them that night, her voice raw from crying. You must take care of each other. You must take care of me. Promise me. I promise, they said in unison. But promises are easy to make when grief has scraped you hollow. It's keeping them when life returns to normal, when the old hungers wake up again, that proves difficult. The forge became Kofi's domain. He had the skill, the patience, the vision that clients wanted. Within a year, he had commissions backed up for 3 months. He invented a new method of folding steel that made blades sharper and more flexible. Traders came from other kingdoms specifically to buy Kofi's knives. He was 16 years old and already people spoke his name with respect. Jide worked alongside him, of course. He manned the bellows, organized the charcoal, kept the books. Necessary work, important work, but invisible work. When clients came, they asked for Kofi. When the king's steward arrived with a rush commission, he handed the specifications to Kofi. When the harvest festivals came and young women giggled behind their hands, they were giggling at Kofi. "You could learn," Kofi told him once, meaning it kindly. "You have the strength. You just need to develop the patience." Jide had smiled and nodded and agreed, and inside, something small and dark had curled tighter around his heart. Then came the beast. It appeared first in the outer villages, in the borderlands where the dark forest pressed against cleared fields. A creature like something from nightmares, larger than any leopard or lion, with fur the color of midnight and eyes that glowed red in the darkness. It killed livestock first, goats, chickens, an entire herd of cattle in one night. Then it killed a farmer who tried to protect his animals. Then his wife. Then their children. The king sent warriors. The beast killed 3 of them and vanished into the forest like smoke. The king sent his best hunters, men who could track a mouse through a rainstorm. The beast left their bodies arranged in a circle, a message that even the illiterate could read. "This land is mine now." Panic spread through Iroko like fever. Families fled the outer villages, cramming into the city, straining resources. The king's authority, the very foundation of order, began to crack. How could a king protect his people if he couldn't protect them from one beast? King Aladil made a proclamation, one born of desperation and pride in equal measure. "Whoever slays the beast of the dark forest will be rewarded beyond measure. They will have land, wealth, and the honor of the crown. They will marry into the royal family and want for nothing for the rest of their days." That night, Kofi came to Jide with a light in his eyes that Jide had never seen before. It wasn't the light of greed or ambition. It was something purer, something that made Jide's stomach turn with shame he couldn't name. "We should try," Kofi said simply. "We should go into the forest and end this. People are dying, Jide. Children are dying." "We're blacksmiths," Jide replied, but his heart was already hammering. "We're not warriors. We're clever. We're strong. We know metal and weapons better than any warrior." Kofi gripped his shoulder, his hand warm and solid. "Besides, we're brothers. Together we can do anything." And there it was, the terrible irony that Jide would remember later, in the darkness of sleepless nights after the feast. Kofi believed in them. Kofi, who could have claimed all the glory for himself, who could have gone into that forest alone and written himself into legend, wanted to share the victory with his brother. Because that's what brothers did. Their mother found them sharpening weapons in the forge that night. Kofi humming an old working song, Jide silent and thoughtful. "You're going after it," she said. "Not a question." "Yes," Kofi replied. She looked between them for a long moment, and Jide could swear she looked at him just a fraction of a second longer. Then she reached up and removed a small brass charm from around her neck, a protective symbol their grandmother had given her, said to be blessed by a powerful priestess. She held it out. Kofi reached for it automatically, but Yatund moved her hand slightly, so that it was Jide who closed his fingers around the warm metal. "Keep each other safe," she whispered, and her eyes, when they met Jide's, held a warning he didn't understand until it was far too late. "We will," Kofi promised, smiling that easy smile that made people trust him instantly. Jide said nothing. He slipped the charm into his pocket and felt it burn against his skin like a coal from the forge. They left at dawn, as the first light broke over Ileo's walls, turning the world from black to gray to gold. They carried spears, knives, rope, and provisions for 3 days. They moved through the city streets in silence, past houses where people were just waking, past the market where vendors were setting up their stalls, past the palace where Princess Amara stood on her balcony, watching them go. At the edge of the dark forest, where cultivated land gave way to wild growth, where the trees grew so thick that noon looked like dusk, Kofi turned to his brother one last time. "Whatever happens in there," he said, his hand on Jide's shoulder, "we come out together. Brothers." "Brothers," Jide repeated, and the lie tasted sweet as honey on his tongue. They stepped into the shadows between the trees, and the forest swallowed them whole. Comment below if you've ever felt the weight of a sibling's shadow, and stay with us to see how deep into darkness Jide's jealousy will take him. The bone flute's voice hung in the air like smoke that wouldn't dissipate, and in that frozen moment between revelation and reaction, Jide's mind had already raced through a dozen explanations, a dozen escape routes, a dozen ways this couldn't possibly be happening. Bones didn't speak. The dead stayed dead. This was a trick, a cruel prank by someone who wanted to undermine his victory. Perhaps a rival, Perhaps one of the warriors whose ego had been bruised when a mere blacksmith succeeded where they had failed. But when he looked at his mother's face across the courtyard, he saw that she was crying. Silent tears that caught the torchlight as they slid down her weathered cheeks. She wasn't surprised. She had known, or suspected, or feared, and now she was simply watching her worst nightmare confirmed by supernatural means she couldn't deny. King Aladil had risen from his throne, his hand now fully on the hilt of his ceremonial sword. Princess Amara had gone pale, her hand still at her throat. The entire feast, hundreds of people who moments ago had been celebrating, had transformed into a jury waiting for the verdict. "Continue," the king commanded, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Let the bone speak its full truth." The shepherd boy, Alyamide, put the flute to his lips again, and this time the voice that emerged was stronger, clearer, terrible in its clarity. "My brother Jide struck me down when my back was turned, when the beast lay dead at my feet. He took my spear, my victory, my life. I lie beneath the great Iroko tree, and the earth remembers. The earth always remembers." The flute fell silent. Alyamide lowered it, his hand shaking, his eyes wide with fear at what he had carried into the king's presence. All around the courtyard, people began to murmur, a sound like distant thunder, building toward a storm. "Lies." Jide's voice cracked across the space, too loud, too desperate. He could hear the guilt in his own tone and hated himself for it, but the words kept coming, tumbling out like water through a broken dam. "This is trickery. Dark magic meant to discredit me. My brother left for the coast. I told everyone this. I told my mother, I told the elders, You told us many things," said a voice from the crowd, and Jide turned to see Elder Babatunda stepping forward, his gray beard braided with wooden beads, his eyes sharp as knife points. "You told us Kofi had left suddenly, without even saying goodbye to his mother. Without taking his tools, his belongings, his inheritance. We thought it strange then. It seems much stranger now." "A bone cannot lie," added another voice. Priestess Adesawa, the keeper of the shrine, wrapped in white cloth that made her look like a living spirit. "The dead do not play tricks. If the earth holds Kofi's bones, if his spirit cries out for justice, then his words carry the weight of truth that no living testimony can match." Jide's mind was fracturing. Everything he had built, every careful word, every practiced expression, every moment of false grief when people asked about his missing brother, it was all crumbling like a termite-riddled wall. He looked toward Princess Amara, hoping to see doubt in her eyes, hoping to see her belief in him, but she had turned her face away, her jaw set in a way that spoke of decisions being made, of futures being rewritten. "The Iroko tree," King Aladil said, and his voice had gone cold as iron in winter. "The sacred grove. We will go there now tonight, and we will see what the earth has to say." "No!" Yatun's voice cut through the murmurs, sharp with a mother's pain. She pushed through the crowd, moving with a speed that belied her age, and before anyone could stop her, she was standing before Jide, her hand raised. The slap echoed across the courtyard like a gunshot. "I knew," she whispered, her voice breaking. "When you came back alone, when you wouldn't meet my eyes, when you burned his spare clothes and said he had taken them, I knew. But I told myself I was wrong. I told myself that no son of mine could murder his own brother. I lied to myself because the truth was too horrible to bear." She turned to the king, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a weight that made even the monarch lean back slightly. "My king, I beg you. Go to the sacred grove. Dig beneath the great Iroko. If my son Kofi is there, if his bones accuse his brother, then let justice fall where it must. Even if it breaks this mother's heart into pieces too small to ever mend." The procession to the dark forest moved like a funeral march. The king rode his great white horse, flanked by his personal guard in their ceremonial armor that clinked with each step. Behind him came the nobles, the elders, the priestess with her attendants carrying torches blessed at the shrine. Jide walked in their midst, no longer honored guest but accused man, with warriors on either side of him whose hands rested casually on their sword hilts. The shepherd boy Alyamide walked ahead, still carrying the bone flute that had appended Jide's entire world. Yatund walked alone, apart from everyone, her wrapper dragging in the dust, her head bowed. People wanted to comfort her, but what comfort could be offered? She was a woman caught between two sons, one perhaps murdered, one perhaps murderer, and there was no possible outcome that wouldn't destroy her. The forest at night was a different creature than by day. The darkness between the trees seemed to pulse with its own life, and the torches pushed back the shadows only reluctantly, as if the forest resented the intrusion. Strange sounds echoed in the canopy, bird calls that weren't quite right, rustling that might have been wind or might have been something watching them pass. Jide had been here before, of course. He knew these paths. He had walked them with murder in his heart and returned with blood on his hands. They reached the sacred grove just after midnight. The great Iroko tree stood at the center, ancient beyond reckoning, its trunk so wide that 10 men could barely encircle it with linked hands. Its roots broke through the earth in massive coils, creating hollows and caves where small animals made their homes. By torchlight, it looked less like a tree and more like a sleeping giant that might wake at any moment. "There," Al-Yamide said, pointing to a spot at the base of the tree, between 2 massive roots. "That's where I found the flute. Just lying on the surface, as if the earth had pushed it up like a gift." King Aladil dismounted. He gestured to his guards. "Dig." They dug. The earth came away easily. Too easily, Jide thought with growing horror. The ground should have been packed hard after all these weeks, but instead, it crumbled like it had never quite settled, like something beneath was refusing to let it rest. Within minutes, the guards' shovels struck something that made a sound too hollow to be stone. A skull. Pale and white and unmistakably human, with the jaw still attached, the teeth intact. The guards pulled it free, and even in the uncertain torchlight, Jide could see the crack that ran from the crown to the temple, the exact shape of the stone he had used when the knife had proven too slow and Kofi's cries had been too loud. "Keep digging," the king commanded, his voice tight. They found the rest of the skeleton within the hour. Ribs, spine, arm bones, leg bones, all of them bearing the marks of violence. The skull's crack. A rib with a knife score. A hand with 2 fingers broken, probably when Kofi had raised it in defense. Each bone told a piece of the story, and together they spelled out a narrative that no amount of eloquent lying could refute. Priestess Adesawa knelt beside the remains, her lips moving in prayers that only she could hear. Finally she looked up at the king, and in the torchlight, her eyes were wet with tears. "This is Kofi, son of Adeyemi. I blessed him when he was born. I know his spirit. And his spirit is not at rest." King Aladil turned to Jide, and the look on his face was terrible. Not anger, not yet, but something worse. Disappointment. The crushing disappointment of a ruler who had believed in someone, who had elevated them, who had been prepared to welcome them into the royal family, only to discover it was all built on blood and lies. "Speak," the king said simply. "And know that lies now will only add to your judgment." Jide opened his mouth. He wanted to lie, every instinct screamed at him to lie, to fabricate some story about self-defense or accident or misunderstanding. But the words wouldn't come. His tongue felt heavy as stone. His throat had closed. He looked at his brother's bones, laid out on the earth like an accusation, and he finally understood something that had eluded him until this moment. The dead have power that the living can never match. The dead cannot be threatened, bribed, or intimidated. The dead have nothing to lose. The dead can wait forever for justice, and time is always on their side. "I killed him," Jide heard himself say, and his voice sounded distant, like it belonged to someone else. "We tracked the beast for 2 days. We found its lair in the deep forest. We made a plan. He would draw it out, I would strike from hiding. But when the moment came..." He paused, and for the first time since the feast began, he felt something other than fear. He felt the terrible relief of truth. When the moment came, he was so brave. He walked right up to that thing, no hesitation, and he called out to it like he was calling a dog. And when it charged, he didn't run. He planted his feet and held his spear steady, and when it leaped, he drove that spear up through its chest and into its heart. Jide's vision blurred with tears he hadn't known he was capable of any more. It died at his feet. And he looked back at me with this smile, this huge triumphant smile, and he said, "We did it, brother. We're going to be heroes." Not, "I did it. We did it." Like he was going to share all the glory with me even though I'd done nothing but watch. "And that's when you killed him," the king said, and it wasn't a question. "That's when I killed him," Jide confirmed. "Because I knew." In that moment, I knew he would share the glory, share the reward, share everything. He would insist I marry the princess alongside him. He would make sure I had land and wealth and honor. Because that's who he was. That's who he had always been. And I couldn't bear it. I couldn't bear being given things as charity when they should have been earned. Couldn't bear being the lesser brother who was lifted up by the greater brother's generosity. He laughed, a sound with no humor in it. So I picked up a stone, and while he was bent over checking that the beast was truly dead, I brought it down on his head. He fell without a sound. I hit him again to make sure. Then I took his spear and pulled it from the beast's chest, and I carried that creature's body back to Ileo myself. It took me 3 days. And every step of the way, I told myself it was worth it. I told myself I deserved this. I told myself history would remember me as the hero and Kofi would just be forgotten. But the earth doesn't forget, Priestess Adesawa said quietly. The ground that drinks blood remembers. The bones sing. The truth finds its way to the light no matter how deep you bury it. King Aladil looked at Jide for a long moment, and Jide saw his own future written in the king's eyes. There would be no mercy. There couldn't be. A man who would kill his own brother, who would build his fortune on fratricide, who would stand in the palace and accept honors while his victim's bones lay unavenged. Such a man was a corruption at the heart of society. Such a man was a sickness that had to be cut out. Take him, the king said to his guards. Chain him. When we return to the city, he will be tried and sentenced according to our law. As the guards moved forward with iron shackles, Jide looked one last time at his mother. She was staring at the bones of her younger son, her body shaking with silent sobs, and she wouldn't look at Jide. Couldn't look at him. He had stolen one son from her, and now his own actions would take the other. She would die alone, childless, the mother of a victim and a murderer. The last thing Jide saw before they dragged him away was a single white flower that had bloomed at the base of the Iroko tree, exactly where his brother's blood had first soaked into the earth. It glowed in the darkness like a small moon, beautiful and terrible, marking the spot where Brotherhood had died and betrayal had taken root. Comment, justice for Kofi. If you believe the truth will always find a way, no matter how deeply it's buried. And tell us, can you ever forgive a crime born of jealousy, or are some betrayals beyond redemption? 3 weeks before the victory feast, before the shepherd boy found the bone flute, before Jide stood draped in silk and accepted the king's praise, Yatun sat in her small house in the blacksmith quarter and waited for her son to lie to her. She had been waiting for weeks now, ever since Jide had returned from the forest with the beast's body and without his brother. Ever since he had told her, eyes averted, voice too steady, that Kofi had decided to leave for the coast, to seek his fortune in trade, to start fresh somewhere new. The story had been plausible enough. Young men did leave their homes, did chase new opportunities. But Kofi had not said goodbye. Kofi had left behind his best knife, the one he had forged himself and never went anywhere without. Kofi had left his mother without a word of farewell. Her morning star would never have done that. Yatund was a woman who had learned early that life gave you 2 choices when it came to unbearable truths. You could look at them directly, or you could look away. Looking directly meant accepting realities that would break your heart into pieces. Looking away meant living in a half-world of denial and doubt, never quite at peace but never quite destroyed either. For 3 weeks, she had looked away. She had accepted Jide's explanation. She had smiled when neighbors congratulated him on slaying the beast. She had stood in the crowd when the king announced Jide would be honored at a great feast. She had sewn the tear in his ceremonial agbada and oiled his scalp and told him she was proud. All while knowing, in the deep places where mothers keep their certainty, that her eldest son had murdered her youngest. The knowledge sat in her stomach like a stone, cold and heavy. It woke her in the night, made food taste like ash, turned joy into a mask she wore for the world while her insides rotted with grief and suspicion. She had loved both her boys, but she had loved them differently. Jide had been her firstborn, the one who made her a mother, the one whose anger and ambition reminded her of herself. Kofi had been her joy, the one whose smile could light up the darkest day, the one who had inherited his father's kindness without his father's defeat. And now one of them was dead, and the other was becoming something she didn't recognize. She was grinding pepper in her mortar when Jide came home that evening, 3 weeks before the feast. He had been at the palace, going through preparations for the ceremony, learning courtly manners from an instructor the king had assigned to him. He looked tired, but he also looked satisfied. Like a man who had finally gotten what he believed he deserved. "Mama," he greeted her, bending to kiss her forehead. The gesture felt hollow, rehearsed. "I brought yam. The king's steward gave me access to the palace stores. Can you imagine? Me shopping from the king's own supplies." "I can imagine," Yatund replied, her hands continuing their work. Grind, grind, grind. The pepper released its sharp scent into the air, making her eyes water. Or perhaps that was something else. Did you hear anything from your brother? She watched his face carefully. There. Just a flicker of something in his eyes before the mask came down. Guilt? Fear? Anger at being questioned? No, Jide said too quickly. Why would I? He's probably halfway to Benin by now. You know Kofi, when he sets his mind to something, he doesn't look back. Does he not? Yatun set down her mortar and looked at her son directly. I remember when he was 9 and had the fever. He looked back at you every night, checking to make sure you were still there beside his mat. I remember when you broke your arm falling from the palm tree. He looked back at you constantly on the run for help, even though it slowed him down. Kofi always looked back, my son. That was his nature. Jide's jaw tightened. People change, Mama. Yes, she agreed softly. They do. An uncomfortable silence settled between them. Outside, someone was playing a drum, practicing for the feast. The rhythm was joyful, celebratory, completely at odds with the heaviness in the small house. I found something, Yatun said finally. She reached into the folds of her wrapper and pulled out a small object, the brass charm she had given to Jide before he and Kofi entered the forest. The protective symbol that was supposed to keep both her sons safe. It was in your room, in the pocket of your hunting tunic. The one you wore when you killed the beast. Jide stared at the charm like it was a serpent. I kept it. For luck. What's wrong with that? Nothing is wrong with that, Yatun said, turning the charm over in her weathered hands. Except that I gave it to you specifically to share with your brother. You both were supposed to carry it, to let it protect you both. But Kofi's tunic, the one you say he was wearing when he left, I found it too. You burned it in the forge, but you didn't burn it completely. Some scraps remained. And this charm was never in those scraps. Which means Kofi never had it. Which means you kept it for yourself from the very beginning. The silence that followed was so complete that Yatun could hear her own heartbeat, loud in her ears like distant drums. What are you accusing me of? Jide asked, and his voice had gone dangerously quiet. I am not accusing you of anything, Yatun replied, though they both knew that was a lie. I am simply trying to understand why my son would leave without saying goodbye. Why he would leave his tools, his belongings, his mother. Why his brother would burn his clothes and keep secrets and avoid my eyes. I am trying to understand so I can sleep at night. Help me understand, Jide. Please. For a moment, just a moment, she thought he might confess. She saw something crack in his expression, saw the weight of his secret pressing against his ability to contain it. The words were right there, on the edge of his tongue. I killed him, Mama. I killed him and I'm sorry and I don't know how to live with what I've done. But then his face hardened again, and the moment passed like a cloud across the sun. There's nothing to understand, Jide said, standing abruptly. Kofi made his choice. I made mine. Soon I'll be married to the princess, living in the palace, and you'll want for nothing for the rest of your life. Isn't that what you always wanted? Isn't that what you always said you deserved? He left without eating dinner. Yatun sat in the gathering darkness, still holding the brass charm, and allowed herself to cry for the first time since her sons had entered the forest. She cried for Kofi, who she would probably never see again. She cried for Jide, who had become someone she couldn't recognize. And she cried for herself, for the impossible choice that was coming, the choice she could feel approaching like a storm on the horizon. Because she knew that if the truth ever came out, and truth had a way of finding the light, no matter how deep you buried it, she would have to choose between protecting her surviving son and honoring her dead one. Between mercy and justice. Between the love of a mother and the demands of righteousness. She knew which choice she should make. She just didn't know if she had the strength to make it. The weeks passed. The preparations for the feast continued. Yatun watched her son become someone new, or perhaps someone he had always been, finally unshackled from pretense. He moved through the world with a confidence that bordered on arrogance, accepting congratulations and praise as if they were his natural due. He ordered new clothes. He spent money she knew the king hadn't given him yet, money that must have come from Kofi's share of their father's estate. He spoke of the future in grand terms. The lands he would acquire, the influence he would wield, the sons he would have who would inherit everything he had built. Never once did he mention his brother's name. The night before the feast, Yatun dreamed of Kofi. He was young again, maybe 7 years old, standing at the entrance to the dark forest. He was calling to her, his voice thin and distant. "Mama, I'm cold. Mama, come find me. Mama, tell them what happened." She woke before dawn with tears on her face and a certainty in her heart that she couldn't ignore anymore. She rose, dressed in her simplest wrapper, and walked to the shrine of the ancestors at the edge of the blacksmith quarter. Priestess Adesawa was already there, tending the eternal flame that burned in honor of the dead. "Elder Mother," Yatund greeted her, using the formal address. "I need to speak with you." Adesawa studied her for a long moment. The priestess was ancient, her face a map of wrinkles that spoke of a lifetime of bearing witness to joy and tragedy in equal measure. "You come with a heavy spirit," she observed. "What burden do you carry?" "A mother's burden," Yatund replied, and then the whole story came pouring out. Her suspicions, the charm, the burned clothes, the way Jide couldn't meet her eyes, the way Kofi had never said goodbye. She spoke until her voice was hoarse, until the sun had risen and the world was bright with morning light. When she finished, Adesawa was quiet for a long time. Finally, she said, "What do you want me to tell you, daughter? That you are wrong? That you should protect your son because that is what mothers do? I cannot give you that comfort. The dead speak to me in dreams, and lately, I have been dreaming of a young man who calls himself Kofi. He is asking for justice. He is asking for his mother to be strong." "I don't feel strong," Yatund whispered. "Strength is not a feeling," Adesawa replied. "It is a choice. And you have already made it, or you would not have come here." That evening, as the sun set and the city prepared for the victory feast, Yatund stood in her house and made a decision. She would go to the feast. She would watch her son receive his honors. And if, when the truth emerged, she would not stand in its way. She would not lie to protect him. She would not weep for mercy. She would give Kofi the only thing she had left to give him. A mother who loved him enough to demand justice for his murder, even if it cost her everything. When the procession to the dark forest began, when the king and his guards and all the nobles and elders marched into the night to dig beneath the Iroko tree, Yatund walked alone at the rear. She had dressed in white, the color of mourning, though no one had died recently. At least, not as far as anyone else knew. She carried no torch, needed no light. She knew where they were going. She had known from the moment the bone flute spoke its terrible truth. When they uncovered Kofi's skeleton, when the skull with its fatal crack emerged from the earth like an accusation, Yatund fell to her knees beside her son's remains. She touched the bones gently, reverently, the way she had once touched his face when he was a baby, counting his fingers and toes and marveling at the miracle of his existence. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the bones, to the spirit that still lingered in this place. "I'm sorry I couldn't protect you. I'm sorry I waited so long to speak the truth I knew. I'm sorry your brother became this. But I promise you, my morning star, I will not let him escape judgment. I will not let your death go unavenged." And when they dragged Jide away in chains, when he looked at her one last time with eyes that pleaded for mercy she no longer had to give, she turned her face away. It was the hardest thing she had ever done, but she did it anyway. Because some truths were more important than comfort. Some loves required sacrifice. And some debts could only be paid in justice, no matter the cost to those left behind. Has a family member's betrayal ever forced you to choose between love and what's right? Share your story below, and let's walk together through this painful truth. The Hall of Justice in Ialeo was not the grand throne room where the victory feast had been held. It was older, grimmer, a place where the stone walls had absorbed centuries of testimonies, confessions, and sentences. No gold adorned these columns. No silk draped these windows. This was a place that dealt in raw truth, and decoration would have been an insult to its purpose. King Aladil sat not on his ceremonial throne but on a simple carved chair at the head of a long stone table. Flanking him were the council of elders, 7 men and women whose combined age exceeded 300 years, whose wisdom was matched only by their reputation for unflinching judgment. Priestess Adesawa sat to the king's right, her white robe seeming to glow in the morning light that streamed through the high windows. To his left sat Princess Amara, who had insisted on attending despite her father's initial reluctance. She had a right to witness this trial, she had argued. After all, she had nearly married a murderer. Jide stood in the center of the hall, still wearing the fine ceremonial agbada from the feast, though it was now stained with dirt from the forest floor and wrinkled from his night in the palace cells. His hands were bound in front of him with iron shackles that rattled whenever he moved. His face was composed, almost serene, as if he had passed beyond fear into some strange calm that came from having nothing left to lose. Around the perimeter of the hall stood witnesses, the nobles who had attended the feast, the guards who had dug up the bones, the shepherd boy Alyamide who still clutched the bone flute as if it were a holy relic. And there, at the very back, nearly invisible in the shadows, stood Yatund. She had not slept. Her eyes were hollow, her face drawn, but she stood straight, bearing witness to the judgment of her son with a mother's terrible duty. "We are gathered here," King Aladil began, his voice formal and carrying none of the warmth it had held at the feast, "to pass judgment on Jide, son of Adeyemi, accused of fratricide, the murder of his brother Kofi, and of deceiving the crown to gain wealth, status and honor built upon that murder. Jide has confessed to this crime in the presence of witnesses. The bones of his victim have been recovered and examined. The evidence is clear. But tradition demands that we hear all testimony before sentence is passed. Who will speak first?" Elder Babatunde rose, his movements slow but dignified. "I will speak, my king. I have known this family for 40 years. I knew Adeyemi when he was a young smith, barely more than a boy. I knew him as a man, as a master craftsman, as a father. And I knew his sons from the day they were born." He turned to look at Jide, and there was more sadness than anger in his eyes. "I remember when these boys were small. Jide was always hungry. Not for food, though they were never wealthy, but for something more. Something he could never quite name. He would watch the king's sons ride by, and his eyes would follow them with such longing. Kofi was different. Kofi seemed content with what he had, grateful for what he was given. It drove Jide mad, I think. To be the elder but always the lesser. To have strength but lack grace. To want so much and have a brother who seemed to want so little, yet received so much anyway." The elder's voice softened. "I do not say this to excuse what he has done. Murder is murder, and fratricide is the worst of murders, a tearing of the bonds that hold families and, by extension, societies together. But I say this so we understand what made this tragedy possible. Jide did not wake up one morning and decide to kill his brother. This was a poison that built up over years, drop by drop, until his soul was too corroded to remember what brotherhood meant. Understanding is not the same as forgiveness," said Elder Omalara, the eldest of the council, a woman whose hair was white as cloud and whose voice still carried the strength of her youth. "We can understand how a wound becomes infected without excusing the infection. We can trace the path that led to this evil without absolving the man who walked it. Jide made choices. At every step he made choices. He chose envy over love. He chose ambition over brotherhood. And when his brother's back was turned, when trust was absolute, he chose murder over honor." She gestured toward the front of the hall, where Kofi's bones had been arranged on a white cloth, still bearing the marks of violence. "These bones tell a story that no amount of eloquent defense can refute. The crack in the skull, from behind, from above, from a blow struck by someone the victim trusted enough to turn his back on. The defensive wound on the hand, proof that Kofi tried to protect himself once he realized his killer's intent. The knife score on the rib, a wound meant to ensure death if the skull crack had failed. This was not an accident. This was not a crime of passion. This was calculated, planned, executed with the cold efficiency of a man who had decided his brother's life was worth less than his own advancement." Priestess Adesawa rose next, and when she spoke, her voice carried a weight that made even the stone walls seem to lean in to listen. "I have served at the shrine for 60 years. I have blessed babies and buried the dead. I have watched the wheel of life turn and turn, seen good people suffer and wicked people prosper, and through it all, I have held to one truth. The earth remembers. Blood cries out from the ground. The dead do not rest when their deaths are unavenged." She moved to stand beside Kofi's bones, one weathered hand hovering over the skull. "From the moment Kofi was murdered, his spirit has been restless. The earth pushed his bones upward, refusing to let them be forgotten. The tree that witnessed his death bloomed a single white flower, out of season, against all natural law, to mark the spot where he fell. And when a shepherd boy, innocent and pure of heart, walked through that grove, the bones called to him. They formed themselves into a flute. They sang their truth." She turned to face Jide directly. "You thought you could bury your crime and walk away. But you forgot, or perhaps you never knew, that the land itself has a conscience. The earth is not just dirt and stone. It is the resting place of our ancestors, the foundation of our society, the witness to all our deeds. You can lie to kings. You can lie to mothers. You can even lie to yourself. But you cannot lie to the ground that drinks your brother's blood. The hall was silent except for the soft sound of someone weeping. Yatund had pressed her hand to her mouth, but the tears came anyway, sliding down her face unchecked. Does the accused wish to speak? King Aladil asked, his voice neutral, giving nothing away. Jide lifted his head. His eyes were dry, his voice steady. What is there to say that hasn't already been said? I killed my brother. I took his victory and claimed it as my own. I stood in this palace and accepted honors I didn't earn. All of this is true. But I want you to understand something. He paused, searching for words. I didn't hate Kofi. That's what makes this so terrible. I loved him. He was my brother, my closest companion, the person who knew me better than anyone. But I loved him and I killed him anyway. Because the wanting was stronger than the loving. The hunger was louder than the bond. He looked around the hall, making eye contact with the elders, with the princess, with the king. You all sit there and judge me, and you should. I deserve judgment. But how many of you have looked at your sibling or your neighbor or your friend and felt that spark of envy? How many of you have wanted what someone else had and thought, just for a moment, why them and not me? I'm not different from you. I'm just the one who acted on it. That is precisely what makes you different, Princess Amara said, speaking for the first time. Her voice was cold, cutting. We all feel envy. We all experience jealousy. It is part of the human condition. But most of us do not commit murder. Most of us do not look at our brother's back and see an opportunity for advancement. Most of us possess something you clearly lack, a conscience that prevents thought from becoming action, desire from becoming deed. She rose from her seat, moving with the controlled grace of someone trying very hard not to show how angry she was. You would have married me. You would have come to my bed with blood on your hands and lies on your tongue. You would have given me children. Children who would have carried the blood of a murderer, who would have been heirs to a crown you had no right to claim. You would have corrupted everything you touched, and you didn't care. You didn't care about anything except your own appetite. I cared about you, Jide said, and for the first time his voice cracked. I know you won't believe me, but I did. When I looked at you during the feast I thought. Do not. Amara cut him off, her voice sharp as a blade. Do not dare speak to me of caring. Love does not grow from soil poisoned with fratricide. Whatever you felt for me was not care. It was possession. I was another prize to be won. Another validation of your worth. And thank the ancestors that the truth emerged before I was bound to you forever. She turned to her father. I have heard enough, my king. Let judgment be passed. King Aladil nodded slowly. He looked older than he had at the feast, the weight of this decision visible in the lines of his face. The law is clear. Fratricide carries the sentence of death. But there are considerations that tradition requires us to address. First, he gestured to Yatund. The mother. Does she speak for mercy or justice? All eyes turned to Yatund. She stepped forward from the shadows, moving like someone walking through deep water, each step requiring enormous effort. When she reached the center of the hall, she stood beside her son, close enough to touch but not touching. My king, she said, and her voice was barely above a whisper, yet everyone heard. I loved both my sons. I still love both my sons. Even now, even after everything, I look at Jide and I see the baby I nursed, the boy who ran to me when he fell, the young man who carried his father's tools with such pride. But I also see the man who killed his brother. And I know what must be done. She turned to Jide, and finally, their eyes met. I wanted to save you, she told him softly. When you came back from the forest, when you lied to me, I wanted to believe you. I wanted to protect you the way I protected you when you were small, when the world seemed too big and too cruel. But I can't protect you from this. I can't protect you from what you chose to become. She turned back to the king. I speak for justice. Let the law take its course. Let Kofi's death be avenged. It is the only way his spirit will rest, and it is the only way I can honor both my sons, the one who died with honor, and the one who must die to restore it. The finality in her voice seemed to settle over the hall like a shroud. Jide's composure finally broke. His shoulders shook, and tears ran down his face, though he made no sound. Then let it be so, King Aladil pronounced. Jide, son of Adeyemi, you are hereby sentenced to death for the crime of fratricide. The sentence will be carried out at sunset tomorrow, in the public square, so that all may witness that justice has been served. Your name will be struck from the records of honor. Your possessions will be returned to your mother. And your brother's bones will be buried with the ceremony befitting a hero, for he was the true slayer of the beast, and his courage will be remembered when your treachery is forgotten. The king paused, then added more quietly, May the ancestors have mercy on your soul, for I cannot. Guards moved forward to lead Jide away. As they did, Alyamide the shepherd boy stepped forward, still holding the bone flute. My king, what should be done with this? King Aladil considered. It has served its purpose. The truth has been revealed. Let it be buried with Kofi's bones, so that his voice can finally rest. But as the guards led Jide past the bones of his brother, something strange happened. The bone flute, still in Alyamide's hands, began to sing again. Softly this time, almost gently. The words it sang were different from before. Brother, I forgive you. But the earth demands its price. Blood for blood, bone for bone. That is the law older than kings. Then it fell silent, and would never speak again. Tell us, is death too harsh a sentence, or is it the only possible justice for fratricide? And can forgiveness coexist with punishment? Drop your thoughts below, and don't forget to subscribe for more powerful African folktales that explore the depths of human nature. The sun set slowly over Iolao on the day of Jide's execution, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that reminded everyone watching of blood and fire. The public square had been prepared according to ancient custom, a raised platform in the center, the executioner's block made from ironwood that had stood witness to judgments for 300 years, and all around, a crowd that had gathered in silence, their faces showing not the excitement that sometimes accompanied such spectacles but rather a collective grief. This was not the death of a stranger or a common criminal. This was the death of one of their own, a man they had celebrated barely a week ago, a reminder that evil could wear a familiar face. Jide was brought out as the last light faded from the sky. He wore simple white cloth, the garment of the condemned, and his hands were bound in front of him. His head was bowed, but not from shame. It seemed more like exhaustion, like a man who had carried a terrible weight for so long that he no longer had the strength to hold his head up. Behind him walked Priestess Adesawa, chanting prayers for the dead, though Jide still lived. The prayers were not for him, exactly, but for the moment between life and death, for the space where a soul must account for its deeds before the ancestors. King Aladil sat on a throne that had been brought to the square specifically for this purpose. Princess Amara sat beside him, her face composed but pale. The elders stood in a semicircle around the platform. And at the very edge of the crowd, nearly hidden, Yatun stood alone, her white mourning cloth wrapped around her thin frame. She had not slept since the trial. She had not eaten. She had spent the day at Kofi's grave, which had been prepared in the cemetery of heroes with proper ceremony and honor. She had spoken to her dead son, apologized to him, begged his forgiveness for not protecting him from his brother's jealousy. She didn't know if he heard her. She hoped he had. As Jide climbed the steps to the platform, movement in the crowd caught everyone's attention. A group of young men, blacksmiths and apprentices from the craftsmen's quarter, were pushing their way forward. They reached the edge of the platform and called up to the king. Your Majesty, their spokesman said, a young man named Teyo who had learned his trade alongside Kofi, we ask permission to speak. King Aladil frowned but nodded. Speak quickly. The sun is setting, and tradition demands this be done before full dark. We knew Kofi, Teyo said, and his voice carried across the square in the stillness. We worked beside him, learned from him, considered him a brother even though we shared no blood. He was the best of us, the most skilled, the kindest, the one who would stay late to help an apprentice who was struggling, who would share his lunch with anyone who had forgotten theirs. When he disappeared, we grieved. When we learned he was murdered, we were angry. We wanted justice. He paused, looking up at Jide, who had raised his head to listen. But now that justice is here, now that blood is about to answer for blood, we find ourselves troubled. Not because Jide doesn't deserve punishment. He does. But because Kofi would not have wanted this. He was not a man who believed in revenge. He believed in second chances, in redemption, in the possibility that people could change. Kofi is not here to speak for himself, Elder Omalara said sharply. The dead cannot advocate for mercy. That is why the living must demand justice on their behalf. With respect, elder, the dead have spoken, Tayo replied. The bone flute's last words were forgiveness. Kofi forgave his brother. Should we not honor that forgiveness? A murmur ran through the crowd. Some agreeing, some objecting. King Aladil raised his hand for silence. The flute also said, blood for blood, bone for bone. That is the law older than kings. Forgiveness and justice are not contradictions. The personal and the social exist in different realms. Kofi may forgive his brother in the world of spirits, but the law must still be satisfied in the world of flesh. A society that does not punish fratricide is a society that does not value the bonds of family. And if family bonds are not sacred, then nothing is sacred. The king looked to Jide. Do you have any final words? Jide stared out at the crowd, his eyes searching until they found his mother. When he spoke, it was to her, though his voice was loud enough for all to hear. Mama, I'm sorry. Those words are too small for what I've done, but they're all I have. I'm sorry I wasn't the son you deserved. I'm sorry I let my hunger eat me from the inside until there was nothing left but teeth and wanting. I'm sorry I killed the best person I ever knew because I couldn't bear being second best. His voice broke. Kofi was better than me in every way that mattered. Not just more skilled or more kind, but more human. More complete. He knew who he was and was content with it. I never knew who I was, only who I wanted to be, and the distance between those two things destroyed me. It destroyed him too. He turned to the king. I know I must die. I understand why. But I want to ask one thing. Not for mercy, not for my life, but for my death to mean something. Let it be a teaching. Let parents tell their children about the blacksmith's son who killed his brother for a crown he didn't deserve. Let it be a warning about what jealousy can do if you feed it instead of fighting it. Let something good come from this evil, even if that good is just a lesson written in my blood. King Aladil nodded slowly. It will be remembered. This much I promise you. The executioner stepped forward, a tall man whose face was covered by a mask, as tradition demanded. He was not a cruel man, not a man who took pleasure in death. He was simply an instrument of the law, no different from the ironwood block or the blade he carried. He positioned Jide at the block, pressing his head down gently but firmly. Wait, a voice called out, and everyone turned to see Yatund pushing through the crowd. She climbed the steps to the platform, moving with sudden energy, as if she had been saving her strength for this final moment. Mama, no, Jide said, his voice muffled against the wood. Don't. But she was already kneeling beside him, her hand on his head, fingers running through his hair the way she had done when he was a child and couldn't sleep. Hush, she whispered. Let your mother say goodbye. She bent close so that only he could hear and she said, I loved you. Through everything, through all the disappointment and anger and grief, I loved you. You were my firstborn, my strong one, my difficult one. And I love you still. But I cannot save you from this. Some debts must be paid. Some broken things cannot be mended. So I give you this final gift. My blessing for your journey. May the ancestors receive you with more mercy than this world could offer. May Kofi greet you on the other side not as your victim but as your brother. And may you find in whatever comes next, the peace you could never find here. She kissed his forehead, her tears falling onto his face, mingling with his own. Then she stood, descended the platform, and walked back to her place in the crowd without looking back. Because looking back would have broken her completely, and she needed to stay whole long enough to see this through. The executioner raised his blade. It caught the last rays of the setting sun, seeming to glow with its own inner light. Somewhere in the crowd, someone began to sing. A morning song, ancient and beautiful, about the shortness of life and the length of eternity. Others joined in, until the whole square was filled with the sound of collective grief. The blade fell. It was quick. Jide's body slumped, his blood darkening the ironwood block that had judged so many before him. Priestess Adesawa stepped forward, speaking the final prayers that would guide his spirit to the ancestors, asking them to weigh his deeds and his remorse, his crime and his contrition, and judge accordingly. It is done, King Aladil pronounced, rising from his throne. Let the record show that justice has been served. Let the family grieve in peace. And let us all remember that the bonds of brotherhood are sacred, that jealousy is a poison, and that the earth always remembers blood. The crowd began to disperse, slowly, reluctantly, carrying the weight of what they had witnessed. Some went home to hold their own siblings closer. suddenly aware of how fragile those bonds could be. Some went to taverns to drink and try to forget. Some went to the shrine to pray for their own souls, recognizing that the line between Jide and themselves might be thinner than they wanted to admit. Yitund remained long after everyone else had left. She stood before the platform where her son's body still lay, covered now with white cloth. She had lost both her boys in the space of a month. One to murder, one to justice. She was alone in the world now, a mother without children, a woman whose family line had ended in blood and shame. But as she stood there in the gathering darkness, she became aware of a strange light. At first, she thought it was torches, but when she looked closer, she saw that it was coming from the ground itself, from the spot where Jide's blood had fallen from the platform and soaked into the earth. A flower was growing there. Not slowly, not according to any natural law, but rapidly, impossibly. It pushed up through the blood-soaked ground, its stem thick and strong, its bud swelling and opening before her eyes. Within minutes, it had bloomed completely, a white flower identical to the one that had bloomed beneath the Iroko tree where Kofi died. Yitund fell to her knees before it, her hand trembling as she reached out to touch its petals. They were soft, impossibly soft, and they seemed to pulse with warm light. "Mama!" She looked up sharply, her heart hammering. The square was empty. There was no one there. But she had heard it clearly. Kofi's voice, gentle and familiar, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Mama, don't grieve for us anymore. The debt is paid. The balance is restored. Jide and I, we are reconciled now. In the world beyond this one, there is no jealousy, no competition, no hunger for things that don't matter. There is only truth, and love, and understanding. We are brothers again, as we should have been all along." "Kofi," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "My morning star. I'm not lost, Mama. Neither is he. We're just elsewhere. And someday, when your time comes, we'll be waiting for you. Both of us. Together." The voice faded, but the flower remained, glowing softly in the darkness. Yitund sat beside it for the rest of the night, keeping vigil over this strange miracle, this sign that even in tragedy, even in the darkest betrayal, there could be grace. There could be redemption. There could be, somewhere beyond the reach of mortal understanding, forgiveness. When morning came, she finally went home. But every day after that, she returned to that spot, tending the white flower that grew where her son's blood had fallen. It never wilted, never faded, blooming year-round regardless of season or weather. People came from all over the kingdom to see it, calling it the flower of brotherhood, the bloom of forgiveness, the sign of reconciliation. And Yitund would sit beside it and tell them the story. All of it, nothing hidden, nothing softened. She told them about two brothers, about jealousy and murder, about justice and mercy, about the terrible price of wanting more than you have and the even more terrible price of taking what isn't yours. "Let my son's story be a teaching," she would say, echoing Jide's final request. "Let it remind you that the ground remembers blood, that truth cannot be buried, and that the bonds we break in life must be paid for, one way or another. But let it also remind you that even the worst sins can be forgiven by those we've wronged, even if the world cannot forgive them. Let it remind you that redemption is possible, even if it comes too late for this life." Years later, when Yitund finally died, peacefully in her sleep, worn out by grief and age, they buried her between her two sons. At her grave, two white flowers bloomed, one on either side, their stems intertwining as they grew, becoming so entangled that you couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. And in the blacksmith quarter, when mothers put their children to bed, they still told the story of the singing bone. They told it as a warning, yes, but also as a promise. That truth will always emerge, that justice will always come, and that even the deepest darkness cannot extinguish the light of forgiveness. The earth remembers. The bones sing. And somewhere beyond the reach of jealousy and hunger and the terrible wanting that destroys us, brothers are reconciled, mothers are reunited with sons, and the only thing that matters is love. Is this justice or mercy, or somehow both? Has this story changed how you see forgiveness? Share your final thoughts, and subscribe to Kaysmart's Mythic Tales for more African folktales that dig deep into the human heart. Tell us, what stories shaped your understanding of right and wrong? We read every comment, and your voice matters in our growing community of truth seekers. The end. Thank you for journeying with us through this powerful tale of brotherhood, betrayal, and redemption. If this story moved you, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear its message. What other African folktales would you like us to explore? Drop your suggestions below. We're listening, and we're grateful you're here.